With a small delay, we waited for the crowds to come in. I have the pleasure to welcome you at the Institute for one lecture still, I think the last lecture of this year. So we have the joy to have with us Dr. Divna Manolova. Dr. Manolova is a researcher of the history of science and Byzantine studies. She's currently working at the Systèmes de Référence Temps-Espace, SYRTE, at the Observatory of Paris. And she works on theories of space and dimensionality in Byzantine cosmological and astronomical texts and diagrams. She's a fellow of the MSCA Co-Fund Fellow of Paris Region Fellowship Program. Her project is entitled Lines and Colors, Lunisolar Diagrams in Byzantine Astronomical Manuscripts from the 9th to the 15th century. And tonight she will talk to us about a cosmological history of human habitation, ideas of the Oikoumenē in late Byzantium. So, thank you, Divna. I'll give you the floor.
Perfect. Okay, so thank you for having me here. Let me just try this. So it's a bit strange for me to speak to you from the height of this podium. I think the atmosphere would have been even better if we were sitting together with a glass of wine and, I can talk to you about this. But so thank you for the patience of listening to it in a lecture format for about 45 minutes or so. And thank you very much, Marinos, Konstantina, Elena, for especially those who are here on your name day. I really appreciate it. And for everybody else who is with us in person and online. So with this, I will start and I will read, and hopefully you would find it interesting. And I welcome your feedback on this, as it is the beginning of a project, let's say. So what I would like to present to you is a research idea which I started exploring very recently, which is the idea of the Oikoumenē, literally the idea of the inhabited region or inhabited part of the world, and the understanding of the human habitation one finds in astronomical texts and in diagrammatic representations preserved in Byzantine manuscripts. So we'll look at texts, at diagrams, and the idea of habitation in relation to Byzantium. That's the general framework. The lived-in, inhabited, and experienced, sensible and sensed place, that is the Oikoumenē, in other words, the world of recorded human habitation, because of course there is also non-human habitation, that can be the subject of a variety of representations. And I start with this one, which is definitely not medieval, but it's a very well-known one that probably you have seen at some point. It is called The View of the World from the 9th Avenue, and it was a New Yorker cover designed by Saul Steinberg and published on 29th of March, 1976. It is very often used to illustrate the idea of a view of the world representation that is simultaneously an expression of a worldview as well. So if I get the pointer right, you can see Manhattan, and then the rest of the world is pretty simplified from the point of view of Manhattanites. I personally, however, find another Steinberg drawing more evocative. And this is his autogeography, which is dated to around 1966. He was born in 1914 in a Jewish family from Râmniciu Vâlcea, which is in today's Romania. And he immigrated first to Italy and then to the USA via the Dominican Republic. His meandering life, cartographed as it were in this drawing, places in close proximity Bucharest and Avignon, Nagasaki, Campulung, and Calcutta, and so spatial relationships together with font size, color use, and stylistic and iconographic tropes translate his life experiences. The autogeography is not a conventional image, even though it draws on existing conventions of representation by labeling, say, for instance, the use of greenish by labeling, or for instance, the use of greenish and bluish hues to distinguish land from water, which is a visual convention employed also in my second example of human habitation, which is this one. This is Tom Comerford's typologist map, and this is built entirely out of conventional elements, and yet it results in being a non-conventional representation of a completely inhabited world. So in the previous one, there were some spaces, river, trees, some places where Steinbeck was not. But here it's a completely inhabited world, one where every space is a geopolitical entity defined by land borders it shares with other such entities. Comerford's map may not represent any particular worldview. It rather reminds the viewer of the fragility of theirs, and it shifts the focus to a new set of complexities based on a country's land borders and neighbors. And this is why my home country of Bulgaria, or Greece next to it, are bigger than the USA, because the US here has only 2 borders, and Romania or Bulgaria or Romania, many more neighbors, therefore they occupy more space on this map. So the idea of the Oikoumenē that was embraced by most Byzantine scholars as a mainstream understanding was framed rather differently from what we have seen until now. And my argument is that it was framed firstly in astronomical and then by extension in geographical terms. And I would argue that it is only after these 2 first frameworks were in place that the further mapping of the Oikoumenē could occur, and thus astronomical geography transitioned into geography proper, and the Oikoumenē filled up with notable mountains, rivers, oceans, and seas, as well as with cities and peoples, and thus geography opened the door for the writing of history, and the sources no longer speak of the inhabited regions, but rather of our inhabited world, our Oikoumenē, or I kathimas Oikoumenē, as is the set phrase in the Byzantine sources. So my discussion is structured in 2 parts, and one is long and one is short. So right when you are really fed up, you would be relieved because the short part will come. So in the first part, I want to introduce you to the idea of our inhabited world, of our Oikoumenē, and how it is framed in cosmological terms in both late Byzantine and ancient works, texts, and diagrams. I will demonstrate how the cosmological definition of the Oikoumenē leads its framing as a geographical concept, and how the latter, in turn, creates the affordances for historiographical, political, and politicized interpretations of the idea of the habitable and inhabited region and regions of the world. The purpose of this excursus is ultimately to argue that any examination of the idea of the Oikoumenē in Byzantium has to account for the underlying cosmological and astronomical principles that define it. Only then it becomes clear that when the expression our Oikoumenē is employed to circumscribe and designate a Roman, a Christian, or an imperial identity, it is precisely the cosmology that it is based on that elevates the thus constructed identity on a cosmic, or if you prefer, universal scale. And of course, as a next step of this project beyond Byzantium, one could also think about this shared cosmology that underlines such ideas, and to compare imperial geographies, or those geographies that share this Hellenistic cosmology I'm going to introduce to you. So that's the first part, the long part. And the short part of the talk just traces very briefly the positioning of this idea of the Oikoumenē in the curricula of Byzantine schools. And by doing so, it questions an idea persistent in scholarship, according to which the disciplinary boundaries between various domains of knowledge studied in Byzantium are very clearly and firmly defined, and moreover coinciding with the observer's understanding of each discipline's remit. And here the same idea can be applied, namely, if I'm going to present how such cosmological ideas of the Oikoumenē fit into Byzantine education, then one can compare with how these shared ideas fit into other types of educational systems that were not the Byzantines, but have common elements. So a few words about the subject, the state of the art, the methodology. The Oikoumenē as a concept was fundamental in cultural, political, and imperial geographies, ancient as well as medieval, and it was connected early on, and especially since Alexander the Great and later on by Polybius, to the idea of universal hegemony. Who ruled over the entire Oikoumenē and whose authority would be recognized across it would be the types of historical questions that tied the geographical concepts of zones of human habitation determined by favorable climatic conditions to ideas of cultural, political, and religious universalism, and consequently fed into the formation of imperial ideologies. It is usually remarked that Christianity endowed the idea of Oikoumenē with its own sets of meanings, but in my opinion, it would be more appropriate to say that it is the set expression Ika Thimas Oikoumenē, or rather the possessive our that comes within it, that lends itself to multiple identities. So not so much the idea of habitation, but of our habitation. And this is exactly that which lends itself to multiple identities, and throughout European history has stood for the Hellenic world, for the Roman Empire, for the Christian community, for the colonial global empires of modernity. They have all made a claim on this adjective our. It is this our and ours and we that is coupled with the concepts of habitability and uninhabitability, and that has helped form what Lachlan Fleetwood recently dubbed genealogies of imperial definitions of habitability. So not only their definitions, not only empires make this claim, but they also have genealogical connection. While the imperial, Hellenic, and Christian underpinnings of the idea of our Oikoumenē, as preserved in the Byzantine literary and historiographical sources, are well known to Byzantinists, and a few names that could be mentioned are Immaculada Perez-Martin and Dimitar Angelov, which they have been working on that idea in recent years. At the same time, the cosmological theories that frame the concept have rarely been discussed. One such exception is Veronica de la Dora's 2021 monograph, The Mantle of the Earth, Genealogies of a Geographical Metaphor. De la Dora includes Byzantium among her early examples, as her discussion leads through the history of Western cartography up to today. Her interpretation of the city plan of Hellenistic Alexandria, simultaneously shaped as Alexander the Great's metaphorical cloak or chlamys, and as the Oikoumenē itself, as per the map of the Alexandrian scholar Eratosthenes. So her discussion of that exemplifies the potential, the complexity, and importance of interrogating the medieval evidence, or in this case, the Byzantine one, against a similar set of questions. The relationship between habitability and empire, how the understanding of the former has shaped the practices of the latter, as well as the legacy of their relationship, has been addressed by generations of geographers also, notably by Clarence Clacken in the 50s and in the 60s, and more recently by Dennis Cosgrove. In 2023, Fleetwood, I already mentioned his name, he added his contribution by studying the connection between ideas of limited habitability and uninhabitability in relation to the imaginary geographies created by European and global empires of the 19th and the 20th centuries. My research builds upon De la Dora and Lachlan's theorizing and examines Byzantine ideas of the same concept of the Oikoumenē in connection to habitability. And I think, to my knowledge, this is a new addition to the scholarship in Byzantine studies. My approach is further informed by the methodologies of two research areas, in which I have been also actively involved in recent years, and which are relatively new, one can say, or the intensity of our preoccupation with them is new. And so one is history of science or history of knowledge. And that has been a part of Byzantine studies actually for a very long time, though not systematically pursued by the field, but at least since the 60s, because the first symposium dedicated to Byzantine studies was organized in Dumbarton Oaks in 1961 by Milton Anastos. So that's one field. And now, as you can see, there is already a publication of the companion to Byzantine science, which gives the opportunity to non-Byzantinists also to refer to it in their teaching, and for this to become part of the teaching in history of science in general. And I have inserted here a QR code of something I'm doing also. And in case you are interested, you can let me know. So it's open bibliography on Byzantine science is a Zotero bibliography. And if anyone wants to become a contributor, I just invite you to send me an email. Otherwise, anyone can use it freely. And then the second field is that of the study of diagrams, which is kind of a new theme for Byzantinists. And it was first introduced by Linda Safran. And then there was a symposium again in Dumbarton Oaks, and you can see the resulting publication, the diagram as a paradigm that, that was published afterwards. And I have also listed the projects I'm part of, but Marinos already mentioned them, so I won't repeat that. So that's the state of the field. Now let's say a few words about, what is cosmology and what do I mean by cosmological? Since I proposed to you that this is the first layer one has to take into consideration always. So as far as I can judge at this moment, there are at least 3 possible epistemic attitudes towards the cosmos in the context of Byzantine science that we can see in the sources. So you can speak about cosmogony, cosmography, and cosmology. All the 3 words are, of course, etymologically derived from Greek, and yet not all 3 are to be found in ancient and medieval Greek. The first 2 epistemic areas are so defined and indeed referred to in Greek from antiquity onwards. So you have cosmogony or cosmogonia, which discusses how the world originated, how it was created, and relies as much on philosophy in the widest sense as on myth and poetry in order to impart understanding concerning the origin of the universe. The second one, the cosmography, it refers to the scientific description and mapping of the world in terms of its general features. What is the state of things in the world? Therefore, usually is also synonymous to geography. So these are ancient terms of our actors also. But we as scholars often talk about cosmology. So what's that? When we speak of cosmology in antiquity and the Middle Ages, that is we, the observers, we usually mean that a theoretical discussion concerning the physical universe, the cosmos, so not the metaphysical, the physical, in its totality, as a system of treatment of its, and a systematic treatment of its structure, order, and the principles that govern it. This is what we usually mean. Cosmology studies everything that is in the physical world, approaches it as an ordered system, and it does not focus on individual parts or elements within the system. Even though it derives its etymologically from the Greek cosmos and logos, nevertheless, it's quite a new word. So in English, it was first attested in 1656. In Latin, it is also a Neo-Latin coinage, which is first used in 1731 by the philosopher Christian Wolff. And actually in Greek, as far as I know, is found for the first time in 1834 in a kind of a handbook on rhetoric, logic, metaphysics, and ethics, which was written by the monk Neophytos Doukas. And he cites Wolff, so he borrows from the Neo-Latin to create the Neo-Greek. Thus, we could say, or I could say, that there is no medieval cosmology in the sense defined by 16th and 17th century historical actors, as certainly no cosmologia is attested in ancient and medieval Greek. It's not an actor's term. Instead, the sources would speak of astronomy, of astrology, but not of cosmology. So for the remainder of this talk, I will use cosmology as a shortcut, but I just wanted to make sure and to make it known that this is not an actor's term. This is our term as scholars today. To illustrate how the Oikoumenē can be defined in cosmological and astronomical terms, now I shall turn first to a 14th century text. This is an introduction to astronomy, and it is in particular an introduction to Ptolemaic astronomy written by Theodore Metochitis, who I guess you all know is a major political figure at the time during the 14th century. He's leading the government of the Byzantine Empire, but he was also an author and a scholar in his own right, and he was particularly interested in studying Ptolemy and astronomy. As far as we know, he did not engage in teaching himself, but his protege and intellectual heir, Nikiforos Grigoras, did run a privately owned school in Constantinople where astronomy was taught. Based on the paleographical evidence, sorry, I just wanted to check if I skipped the slide, but no. Based on the paleographical evidence, we also know that Grigoras, or the student, he annotated his teacher's introduction to astronomy in one particular manuscript. And since Grigoras himself studied and then taught the same type of astronomy, we can hypothesize that this textbook by Metochitis was used at least in the very restricted educational environment of the teaching circle Grigoras ran. And indeed, the textbook is preserved in 11 manuscripts. So it's not 100, but it's not nothing. And we have an attested reader who was himself a teacher. So we could argue for this kind of setting. Now, the Oikoumenē is the subject of 3 chapters of book 1 of this textbook. Yeah, you can see them here in the lower half of the slide. So the first one, chapter 10, it's titled that the region, Tmima, of the Earth below the celestial equator is uninhabited, i.e. Keton, and the reason for it being so. And I have to say here that this discussion of habitability and inhabitability of certain zones, especially the torrid zone below the equator, was an ancient one. It's not just a medieval phenomenon. And there were various opinions, so there was no consensus in the ancient literature they knew. So that's the first of the 3 chapters that treats the subject, and it speaks in general terms about habitability. The second one, chapter 11, now says that the 4 regions of the Earth on each side of the equator, the northern and the southern, 2 above and 2 below, are naturally habitable, Oikoumenē, because they are temperate, os efkata. So now we have these 4 regions and some conditions about them. And then chapter 12, the third, that our Oikoumenē, Ikathimas Oikoumenē, is comprised in one of the 4 regions, namely in the upper north region, and its beginning occupies the space from there, and concerning the circles conceived alongside it. Now, this is a bit vague, but the point is that first we speak about habitability in general, then about 4 regions, now about one precise region in which we live, with the actors. The astronomical definition of the Oikoumenē is based on the relative spatial positioning of the Earth and the Sun. In these titles, it is the relationship between the Earth at the universe's center and the luminary that orbits it and defines its geography in terms of first limited inhabitability and then of limited habitability. So all of this is just a function of our location in the cosmos with respect to the sun and its light and heat. So this is clear from the title of chapter 10, which we have already seen, where we are told that the region that is inhabitable is the one below the celestial equator. So already a terrestrial region is defined in cosmic terms. That is, the spatial relationship creates the climatic conditions that ensure or prevent habitation, but it is not the sole relationship that defines the Oikoumenē. In fact, it creates 4 habitable environments, as it is clear from the title of chapter 11. Okay, so there is a cosmic component, but that condition makes for 4 regions, not for just one. How is that one defined? So our Oikoumenē is defined as one of 4 zones with temperate climate and therefore habitable. Its geographical location is unique and clearly indicated. It is located in the upper north region, and yet this is a necessary but not a sufficient condition for the circumscription of the region our historical actors refer to as theirs. And if we look again at the title of chapter 12, that our Oikoumenē is comprised in one of the 4 regions, namely the upper north region, and it begins occupying space from there. In sum, habitability or inhabitability, of course, relates to climatic conditions, and they are or not favorable to human life. However, those climatic conditions are a function of the structure of the universe and of the relative positioning of the movement of 2 key celestial objects, the sun and the earth. So how is this defined in in more details by Metochites in the first geographical chapter. And I quote, "The region of the earth where the celestial equator is directly above is uninhabited. The sun stands twice on top of this area, once when it passes the beginning of Aries and again at the beginning of Libra." So you see there are also particular moments in time that are defined through the ecliptic and through the zodiac. For this region, we were saying that the part of the earth lying below the celestial equator is uninhabited because of the high temperature and the extreme drought. As is evident, there are other regions of the earth where the sun, during its revolution, stands directly above them twice, but not in the same manner as it occurs in the regions of the earth below the equator. At these other locations of the earth, where the sun stands twice directly overhead, it heats them with some moderation. For this reason, the region of Earth below the aforementioned parallel is more moderate for habitation, in spite of the fact that the sun stands there twice at zenith. The region below the equator is completely uninhabited. A geographical location here is explained in terms of celestial coordinates. In this case, the alignment of the terrestrial and the celestial equator. The region located just below the celestial equator is what elsewhere would be referred to as the torrid zone and therefore uninhabitable. Habitability is a function of the sun's movement around the earth, and the localization of habitable and uninhabitable zones is described in this way at a universal scale. Metochites, in this text, he writes in the tradition of Ptolemy, but it should be said that the conception of zonality, both terrestrial and celestial, of course, predates the Alexandrian astronomer. Within an ancient Greek scientific tradition, whether cosmological or astronomical, or cosmographical, geographical, two fundamental geometrical structures for mapping the celestial and the terrestrial sphere, respectively, they gradually set place as early as 4th century BCE and were subsequently consolidated by the 2nd century of the Common Era as basic and fundamental principles. So that's also interesting. You have a skeleton, basically a structure of the universe that maps terrestrial and celestial territories, if you were, and in diagrammatic geometric terms, they are very similar and can overlap, which says something about diagrams and what they can do also. So I'm in this referring to the idea about the celestial circles and correspondingly the terrestrial zones, the former aligned with the latter. While I will be speaking about the scientific texts written in Greek, these fundamental geometrical cosmographical structures would be common to many cultures of the Hellenistic world in Europe and in Asia, and to their medieval counterparts. So that's why I said it's interesting to see if the conclusions I can propose for this material would be valid for other cultures too. The idea of the alignment of the celestial circles and terrestrial zones is, for instance, very clearly illustrated in this 15th century diagram you see on the screen, which is copied in another astronomical textbook. So we've seen one 14th century Byzantine textbook, we will return to it. Now we're looking at another one. It is a Stoic textbook called The Heavens, written by an author called Cleomedes. But we see it in its 15th century copy, so in a late medieval copy. And I will refer often to this text in my talk today, in particular when I show you diagrams, which illustrate cosmological models and the places of the Oikoumenē within them. At the same time, I will also use the heavens as a connecting thread, one that helps me juxtapose different types of textbook texts used for the teaching and learnings of astrosciences. So on the one hand, you have textbooks composed by Byzantine authors, like that by Metochites, and I'll add another one by George Pachymeris, called the Quadrivium. And on the other, you have the Hellenistic teaching texts, such as the Heavens, and they were widely copied and read in Byzantium from the late 13th century onwards. And of course, all of them contain diagrams. It has to be said also that the Hellenistic textbooks are more introductory in terms of level, and of course, Ptolemy's astronomy is a higher level of mathematics. So if we look at a bit, okay, you cannot see the whole diagram, so I leave this one. So if we look at the diagram a bit more closely, you can imagine that, so this is the Earth in the center, and this is, let's say, the universe as a whole. And you can see as parallels, actually, the circles that are fundamental for mapping these two locations. So you have the Arctic, the summer tropic, equator, winter tropic, and Antarctic circle. And in the text, we've read the two equators were aligned, that of the Earth and that of the universe. So that quite often can be expressed in a diagram in this way. But also what that means is that every point on the Earth sphere can be projected on the sphere of the fixed stars of the heavens. So you can have a projection of every single point terrestrial onto celestial scale, which as a principle allows for mapping the geography of the Oikoumenē on a celestial scale, if one would like to do that. And of course, that can be confined to a scientific milieu, but that allows then for this universalist pretension that an empire can add to such a concept. Or to frame this in the terms of Metochitis, and I quote him again. So he says, as in the practice with the celestial body, the Earth is divided in 360 degrees and is contained within the stellar globe. So I think you kind of see that now in the 15th century diagram. And of course, I've given you a modern day rendition, which is, as you can see, also a different graphic language that we use today. So these 360 parts lie below the corresponding celestial regions in the north or south, with the coordinates on the surface of the Earth being extensions and projections of the coordinates on the celestial sphere. So when Metochitis writes about the earthly region below the celestial equator, this is what he envisages, that this region here can be plotted out on the sphere, and especially connected to the movement of the sun and the path of the sun. So if we move now to the second step in defining terrestrial habitability, so we move to the second chapter, chapter 11, where the 4 regions are defined. And I quote again, furthermore, the body of the Earth is divided first by the plane of the horizon into 2 regions, one region above and one below the horizon. In each of these 2 parts, a second incision subdivides them into 2 parts, one occurring to the north of the equator, to the right, and another to the south. So you see there are many spatial words also. They're not only directions, but some things are described as right or left. On each side of the uninhabited region, there are the 4 zones, the upper and the lower northern, as well as the upper and the lower southern. So you have up and low to add to these spatial words, which are habitable due to their temperate nature. End of quote. Needless to say, the theorizing of the 4 habitable regions also predates Metochitis and Ptolemy, and it is also an idea that was consolidated by the early imperial period. I'm speaking about Europe. For the sake of comparison, let's have a brief look at a much earlier text, which is Aristotle's Meteorologica, but again in a medieval copy, so in a 12th century manuscript, which also, as you can see, includes a diagrammatic representation. So this time, this is not the universe, this is the Earth. So you can see in this spherical cosmology, where the Earth is a sphere, which is in the center of the bigger sphere, the simple shape of a circle can really stand for a number of things. And that again goes to the functionality of diagrams. So by now you're familiar with the language, so you know this, that the sphere is the Earth and this would be the equator. And you can see how the different zones are, how the Earth is partitioned into zones. Now, what Aristotle postulates are not 4 habitable regions, not 1. He postulates 2 regions, one in the north, you see them in green, so one in the north and one in the southern hemisphere. And he makes a point to discuss their shape. So the shape is important, just like we saw, I briefly mentioned that the city of Alexandria, its shape is compared to Alexander the Great's cloak and that shape. So here the shape is again important for Aristotle's discussion also. He emphasizes that they are shaped like a drum. So I don't know, you can interpret what the diagram shows in this sense. But after that, he's subsequently going to criticize the idea of a circular world map and deny its functionality, which is also a very interesting thing because, as you know, many maps afterwards in the history of cartography are circular, many world maps in Macrobius in the West or the Theo map that are also common in Europe and not only. But Aristotle makes a point of saying that it is impossible for the habitable zone to be represented as a circle, since obviously the big circle, the circular representation would befit only the whole of the Earth rather than the Oikoumenē. 2 or 4, the fact that there are regions where habitation is possible does not necessarily mean that they are inhabited. So this is just logical that they would be habitable. At the same time, since one of them certainly is, and that's the region where our historical actors are, once differential habitation is discussed on a global or planetary scale, the need to differentiate our Oikoumenē from the possible other arises. So since we logically can postulate more, we know ours is ours, how do we differentiate from others? And now we go to the third and final chapter. We already know a little bit about it. So here in this third geographical chapter from Metochites' introduction, chapter number 12, this is the longest of the 3. So in that one has as a goal to define our Oikoumenē as one of the 4 temperate regions which are located above the horizon and towards the north. If you want to compare to the way you imagine the globe, it is not meant that Europe is in one zone and Asia is in another partition. The whole of Afro-Eurasia that is known is one of these quarters, one of these 4 parts. Further, we continue with Metochites. Our Oikoumenē's location is again described by him in astronomical terms. And I quote, "It is between the parallel circles of the heavenly sphere, starting from the equator to the north. The parallel circles he refers to this time are the so-called climes. A climb or klima, to quote the Tumor's definition, he was the one who edited the Almagest and who translated the Almagest into English. So to quote Tumor, a climb is defined as a specific band of the Earth where the same phenomena, for instance, how long is the longest day, are found, which means that every city in that area will have the longest day of the same duration, 14 hours, 15 hours, etc. Hence, in early Hellenistic times, there arose the division of the known world, the Oikoumenē, into 7 climata. And maybe you are familiar already with this idea, but basically they start from Meroi in the south and they go north to what was called Borysthenes, but it's today's Dnieper river. So when describing our inhabited region in terms of the standard climes, or if you prefer, you can think about them as geographical parallels, Metochites references 3 works of Ptolemy. He references the handy tables, the geography, and the Almagest. The climes are listed by him from south to north, starting with the climb for Meroi. They are again defined in astronomical terms with the help of celestial coordinates. The northern parallel of Meroi is the parallel at the end of Gemini and at the beginning of Cancer. The southern is the equator, that is the parallel at the beginning of Aries and Libra. In order to illustrate how the climes are projected under given points of the ecliptic, let us use again a diagram. We are again in the 15th century, and this is again a copy of the Heavens by Cleomedes. So I'm reading to you from Metochites, and I'm showing you images from Cleomedes in this case. But in this case, we see a diagram of the entire universe, which also has the climes. And that's why I wanted to show you how the projection of the points can happen in such an image, and also how such an image can have a sort of a claim on universality. So we have the entire universe in an opening of a manuscript on a plain surface. And the text is preserved today in Paris, but it was produced in Sparta in 1450. and by two professional scribes and scholars, Haritonimus Hermonimus and John Evgenikos. And there is a colophon that attests to that. The codex as a whole preserves a collection of cosmological treatises, including Pseudo-Aristotle's on the cosmos and Cleomedes' the heavens. And in this diagram, as I said, this is the whole of the universe, but this part, the upper right quadrant, represents the Oikoumenē with its 7 climes. And first we have the partition of the 4 zones that are theoretically inhabited. And now you have the climes, zoom on the climes. And you can see I have also listed them on the slide. The numbers, the Arabic numerals indicate how long is the longest day in each climb. And I think you can, for those who can read the Greek, you can see on the image on the left that first if we start from the bottom and then go up, we first have the uninhabited zone, Aikitos Katepsigmeni, and then you have all the climbs listed. And you can see they're also numbered. So you have the 7th, the 6th, etc., up to the top of the diagram. And there is a label that says Ikasimas Oikoumenē. So it combines all the kind of keywords I have been mentioning so far. This diagram of the entire universe, which casts the sphere on the cosmos on a plane surface, as I said, was prepared by 2 professional scribes in Sparta in 1450. So we have the climbs listed from Meroe, which is in today's Sudan, through Alexandria, Rhodes, the Black Sea, up to the river Dnieper in the north. By virtue of its design, it also inscribes them within the universal cosmic system, and it includes the planetary and elementary spheres as well. And I will just briefly go back to show you. So I think you can see this is the sphere of the air, and you can see at the edge the fixed stars. So there you have all the stars, and you can see the sun in 4 cardinal positions. So at the solstices and the equinoxes. So that would be the sphere of the sun and its movement. And you can see within the band of the zodiac also the planets. Let's say Mercury is here, and I need my glasses to read further up, but you see all the planets, and within that the elemental spheres, and then the Earth in the center. So it's a cosmological image that combines all the basic blocks of the universe. Thus, with its diagrammatic design, John Evgenikos, because he is the one who made this particular part of the codex, he achieves a definition similar to that of Metochitis' introduction, namely the geographical concept of all the habitable regions and that of the historical actors' inhabited region. They receive a cosmological and astronomical definition. They are not defined geographically only. And just to show you another example, how this also translates into geography, into a famous geographical codex. So this is the well-known manuscript of Ptolemy's geography from the 13th century, Ogbinas Grecus 82. And you have Ptolemy's first projection of the map of the inhabited world. You can see clearly the map, Europe, Asia, Africa. You can see what's characteristics of Ptolemy geography is that the inhabited world is not surrounded by a world ocean, but it's enclosed by land. And you can see some figures, heads which blow air. So this would be the winds. And to the right, maybe you can see something else. And if we zoom a little bit, so we see to the right or to the east, we see the zodiac. You can see Gemini, Cancer, Taurus, Leo, Virgo, and the Ram, Aries, in this close-up. And you can see the sun positioned in each of those zodiacal signs. So this is not about the astrological meaning, this is about the mapping on the sky. So the sun is in the part of the sky where this constellation is. And if you pay attention, you can see that each position of the sun, there are rays of sunlight coming out. usually 6 of them. And you can see how the middle ray aligns with the grid, with the respective parallel. I don't know if it's visible, but here you can see. So the middle ray of sunshine basically continues and aligns with the respective parallel on the grid. And I have listed for you, I have even a better close-up. So if we have the quotation from Metochitis again, the northern parallel of Meroe is the parallel at the end of Gemini and at the beginning of Cancer. So this is not necessarily immediately clear to us, I suppose. But when you see this map which predates Metochitis, but it's from the same tradition as it's Ptolemaic in the same way Metochitis' treatise is, you see the sun in between Cancer and Gemini, and you see this middle ray, which aligns and becomes the relevant parallel that will cross Meroe. So this is for me one instance where the complexity of these ideas, which you see across diagrams, text, and maps, is really well illustrated. And to finish our discussion of the Metochitis, let us move on. So circumscribing the Oikoumenē through the celestial circles under which it lies, however, can be performed for each of the habitable zones. This is why he has to specify that for the climb of Meroe situated first as known to be inhabited in our Oikoumenē, thanks to those who wrote the geography and the history and geography of its regions. In other words, what makes our Oikoumenē ours is that it is a habitable region whose inhabitants have produced a historical and geographical record we are familiar with. So there are 4 of them logically, but 1 is recorded in history. It is precisely the availability of this record and Metochitis' familiarity with it that allows him to go one step further and to criticize Ptolemy with respect to the use of the 7 climes. And he says, in this manner, Ptolemy narrates and describes the parallel in his geography. Personally, I do not think it is very useful, nor does it suffice to record only the parallels for the 7 habitations, since there are numerous other inhabited places on either side of them, especially in the north, and I am terribly aware and beyond the 7 habitation at the mouth of Borysthenes, we do not enter an uninhabited unknown region. So Dniepro is not the end of the inhabited world. But we enumerate the parallels and the corresponding extensions of the days up to the region we consider as known, up to the inhabited regions of Little Britannia, which we readily accept as Oikoumenē. So as I was reading today this, I was thinking Metochitis was very European, pro-European before he knew that was a problem for us today. So again, a similar idea can be found in Cleomedes, says the heavens, in his description of the zones of the earth, habitable and inhabitable. I will read through only some relevant portions of the text. And again, I will show you a diagram. This time it's from the 14th century, and it is penned by the hand and most likely designed by the erudite scribe and scholar Neophytos Prodromenos, who was based in Constantinople at the time. Cleomedes writes, the natural philosophers call these parts of the earth zones and say that while each of the outer zones is uninhabitable because of icy cold, the one at the exact center is uninhabitable because of a blazing heat. And those on either side of it are temperate since they are each tempered by the torrid and frigid zones adjacent to them. Yes, and I think I can continue a little bit further. So by further dividing each of these temperate zones into 2 with respect to the hemisphere thought to be the upper earth, and the one thought to be the lower, so again the same spatial words appear, they say that there are 4 inhabited zones. We, humans, of whom there are direct reports, inhabit one of these, and the people called circumhabitants another. And then he would enumerate the rest of the groups that inhabit the earth, including the antipodes. So in this English translation by Todd and Bowen, They translated imas tous historiomenos anthropos as we humans of whom they are direct reports. Above, I spoke about us, that is the historical actors we, so us who are on the historical record, who are historicized and recorded in history. This particular part of the text, Prodromenos, when he read, he rendered differently. He rendered it by designing a diagram. So first, this is a diagram of the celestial circles and not of the terrestrial zones. So something we have already discussed, that they can match, they can have a similar geometric skeleton. And then that also means that one marker of spatiality is substituted by another. And you can see the diagram is labeled as the sphere, the heavenly sphere. And you can see the zones we've seen before, like the northern Arctic zone, the southern tropic, then the equator or equinoctial circle, then the ecliptic. Ecliptic means this is really not a terrestrial diagram. So that's one thing that happens. He uses a celestial image to accompany the part of the text that speaks about terrestrial segmentation. And I have marked the equator, and to the right, you can see the translations of the labels marking it, the tropics, the Arctic and Antarctic circles. So I started this talk by remarking on the alignment, whether conceptual or in diagrammatic imagery, of celestial circles and terrestrial zones. Here, the terrestrial zonality is entirely absent, and yet the habitability of the Earth and its inhabitants is not. Moreover, they are not inscribed into the sphere of the cosmos as they were on our 15th century examples that were designed by John Evgenikos. In a much, I would say, bolder gesture, and this is indeed a design that comes from Neophytos, not copied from ancient models. So what he does is to take the labels for the inhabitants of each temperate and habitable zone, and he takes them out of the space of the cosmos, and he places them correctly with respect to the cardinal directions, and then each label is outside of the world, but it's anchored in this celestial diagram discursively with the use of the relative ode. You can see everywhere, ode, 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 and ode. So in other words, each label, while itself is not geographical, is anchored to a locality through the use of a relative pronoun, that place in which so-and-so live. Further, each label's locality is mapped in astronomical terms through the celestial circles, which are within the diagram, and then by positioning the labels on this extra cosmic scale. Indeed, labels such as where our antipodes live do not belong within the zonal celestial diagram, and yet the ways in which they both anchor to it with the repetitive ode and unfold it by being placed outside of its rim make for a powerful statement concerning habitability and its claim on the cosmos as a whole. On this diagram, the first long part is over. So with a little bit of a relief, now we can just briefly gloss over the second part, where I would like to say something about the theorizing of the Oikoumenē in the curricula in late Byzantine schools. And as I promised, that would be brief. So far, I drew on one textbook, an introduction to astronomy written by Theodore Metochitis, which was of limited circulation, certainly read by his protege Gregoras, possibly used by Gregoras in his private teaching circle and preserved in 11 manuscripts. I also frequently juxtaposed this textbook by Metochitis with another one, The Heavens, a treatise by Cleomedes, in which a number of the same themes were addressed. The Heavens, together with several other extant Hellenic astronomical handbooks, such as those by Geminos or by Theon, provided introductory, both elementary and fundamental, knowledge concerning the celestial phenomena, and they did so in a concise manner without incorporating geometrical demonstration. Intended for teaching intended for teaching, these textbooks cover themes such as the lunar phases, the eclipses, the theory of the terrestrial zones. And what I think is really fascinating about them is their continuous use since Hellenistic times up to the late medieval period, and then they get translated into Latin and are used even further. The heavens in particular becomes very popular in the late 13th century, and its medieval tradition amounts to more than 80 manuscript witnesses, which is more or less the same as Ptolemy's Almagest in Greek. So that's also significant. Since the historiography on astronomy in Byzantium has been and still is focused mostly on Ptolemy and Ptolemaic astronomy, and that is of course not unreasonable, but that also means that the introductory textbooks of the Hellenistic and later periods were and remain largely unacknowledged by scholarship as constituents of Byzantine curricula for the teaching and learning of the sciences. My research so far shows that just as the astronomy of the Almagest had its place in some schools and in some curricula, the fundamental cosmological and cosmographical knowledge which the heavens and such more elementary books provided had also its place in other schools in other parts of the curriculum. And it was part of the education in the astrosciences, and it actually opened the door for other epistemic domains, such as, for instance, geography. This kind of knowledge was also used for rhetorical speeches and even in the composition of erudite letters. So what I would like to do in this final part of my time is to discuss only one example, which is of another textbook, or handbook. This handbook was written also by a Palaiologan author. His name is George Pachymeris, and he was himself a reader of Cleomedes' The Heavens. So we have a little bit of this genealogy between scholars, textbooks, and readers. So his treatise, which is often referred to as the Quadrivium, in fact, its full title is Syntagmaton Tessaron Mathematon, Arithmetikis, Musikis, Geometrias και Astronomias. So, treatise on the four mathematical sciences: arithmetic, music, geometry, and astronomy. He was himself a student of George Akropolitis in Constantinople, and therefore was educated and was teaching these four mathematical sciences in addition to philosophy in Constantinople. What is important about his textbook is that it is unique in the sense that it's the sole quadrivium that survives from the Byzantine period, which is connected to a known author and moreover survives in an autograph manuscript. So we can see sorry, I jumped over. This is the autograph of this book, which is a codex now in Rome in Biblioteca Angelica. So it's a unique or a very rare case when we can have the sort of format and arrangement that the author envisaged for us to have. So which part of this textbook are concerned with the questions we've been discussing about habitability, about the Oikoumenē, about inhabitability? In fact, not many. So he speaks about this topic rarely, and I chose out of those occasions one particular case, which is when he speaks about the torrid zone, the one that's below the equator, too hot to inhabit. He speaks about it twice, once in the textbook and once in a rhetorical exercise. So if we look at the quotation from the textbook, and I won't read the whole quotation, just the end of it, you see it's in the same style, in the same language as everything we've seen so far from the other textbooks. I just read the end of the quotation. For truly southern are those regions themselves located beyond the equator and the torrid zone. So again, we have the geographical location defined in cosmological terms. And there is another temperate zone, which has above our antomy, those who live on the same side of the equator, but under the opposite meridian and below the antipodes. And I just briefly want to show you that this rare word, antomy, it has only 5 occurrences in the TLG, and it's one of those words that he borrows from Cleomedes. In addition to direct references, this is another proof that he was reading this textbook. Now, the second time he would refer to the torrid zone is in, as I said, in a rhetorical exercise, apogymnasma, which takes the topic of the torrid zone, and this is a very unusual choice. This is not a traditional exercise. It demonstrates something about his knowledge, but also about his teaching. And this is the full text of the exercise, and I'm going to read it to you. He writes, "The one who wishes to learn about the zone in the heavens, which is in the middle of the rest and is torrid, as reason comprehends naturally, this person should take into account the well-known chariot driving of Phaethon." So suddenly myth appears, something we didn't see before in the textbooks. He was a child of Helios, rich in fatherly love. Thanks to it, he was able to address him freely. Now then, he was present in front of his father, and as he demanded persistently, he persuaded his father to step away from the chariot, mounted on which he was entrusted to cut a path through the stars each day. However, as he, Phaethon, was the favorite, he took it and rode it at once. As he was inexperienced, he was swept away from the straight path, and unwillingly he was carried out in a disorderly manner on this heavenly road by Helios's fire-breathing horses. Moreover, the confusion of the horses and the irregular drive resulted in a damage to the zone. Since at this time he was near the temperate zone, he made it warmer, and against the nature it was scorched. The calamity came first and towards the earth, and he perished suddenly below the same place that is the inhabited land. So you can see how suddenly we are on the cross between cosmology and cosmogony, because the origin of the torrid zone is presented to us. And at the same time, to understand this, one needs to know what the torrid zone is, what the temperate zone is, and also something about the alignment of celestial and terrestrial zones, as Phaethon is scorching the celestial zone, but then falls into the terrestrial region that becomes then torrid. So far, and in this talk, I've made three major points: that the Oikoumenē in general, and our actors Oikoumenē in particular, receive first and foremost, in my opinion, a cosmological definition, both through text and diagram. This becomes evident thanks to the study of the scientific literature in Byzantium and the manuscripts that preserve it. Therefore, habitability and human habitation receive a cosmological treatment. Habitability is dependent on the favorable climatic conditions, but in these texts, it is rather framed as a fact resulting from the relative positions within the system of the universe, of the sun and the habitable regions. In other words, the Oikoumenē is built in the structure of the universe. It's inevitable. Second, as a subject to be studied and learned, the topic of the Oikoumenē, like so many other themes, is treated both discursively and diagrammatically by the Byzantines, in their reading of ancient texts, in their own compositions, and across disciplinary domains as different as rhetoric and astronomy. And third, our actors Oikoumenē is the only one out of four, on the historical and cosmographical record. The one that is historicized and therefore can be theorized further. And yet, and with this I conclude, as Theodore Metochitis wrote in his essay on Greek history, the awareness that the Greeks have recorded their history as far as the Oikoumenē extends, but not that of other peoples, inevitably also brings the realization that, and I quote him, "In the same way that the history of other nations is unknown to us because the Greek historians did not concern themselves with their affairs, so perhaps our history is unknown to them because their historians did not bother to concern themselves with our affairs." Thank you very much for being here and for your patience. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Perhaps, I don't know if it's too much to digest and we're too few to digest it. At least, okay, you know that I found it quite interesting. I hope I wasn't the only one, and I don't know if there are any questions or comments.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I would like to ask you about the concept of, in history of science and history of astronomy, the concept of Sozenta phenomena, a concept of DM concept, and how all these ideas in the late antiquity and the Byzantine science survive in this projection, in these diagrams. I think all the concept is in order to have a measurement of the celestial, not only orbits, the celestial idea about the Oikoumenē. But I don't find any historiographical material in your presentation to have a comparative with this medieval science and this medieval survival of this idea of Sozenta phenomena. I don't know, it is really that in Byzantine historiography, there's no idea about Sozenta phenomena. It is only a European, and this is the Kuhnian, I don't know, idea. When all the medieval science go to the European 200 years after the Pachymeris and etc. The idea is if in these regions, all the regions of Oikoumenē, you can find these ideas, this concept of Sozenta phenomena. This one. And the second one, the second question is about one of the last diagrams about the boundaries of Oikoumenē. How they explain the boundaries when they stop the inhabitants and the inhabitants. For example, how they interpret this the stop. You told about the Frisi region, etc., but I think that it's very difficult to have a definition about the boundary. That's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for surviving the lecture and for having such interesting questions to ask too. And I want to go back to the map maybe so that we can look at the boundaries. So maybe I start from the second one by saying that I don't really have definite answers, but some things I know about what you're asking. So which diagram would be, is this one would be a good one? Okay, so I think, oh wait, maybe not that. So, I mean, in this diagram, the Oikoumenē would be there'll be the four regions, and that would be the one we know from the historical record. So that one is defined in Ptolemaic terms, in terms of the climes. So I think the one thing that happens with this kind of diagrams that I've been showing you, so they all, first of all, they are all what I decided to call cosmological, or maybe you agree. And second, they all come from textbooks. So this is, if you want to think about it, this is kind of the canon, or one canon that one would teach. And this is not the frontier of contemporary science as it happens, if it happens, right? So this would be a basis that, like if you think of textbooks today. So in this sense, this is a traditional view. And this is why I read at some point to you the quotation from Metochitis, who disagrees with this and says, whether we know this from Ptolemy, but I know north from this, there are other people, I mean, further north, much further north. So as far as I understood from other colleagues, but I have not pursued it further. So somebody had asked me, so okay, the north, fine, let's say, but what about the boundary to the south? Because there are reports, and especially because of, especially towards the later Middle Ages, because of reports coming from Asia, they must have known that there is something further down from Ethiopia. And in fact, there is in Plato, so like in a 15th century author, you have him discussing classical authors like Strabo, but then himself speaking about adding that Strabo didn't know that there are two Ethiopia. There is the one that the classic sources speak about, and there is yet another one, which is, let's say, further south. And yet, these are all, how to say, this is all school literature. So in a way, doesn't reflect or doesn't allow itself to reflect if these authors are aware of reports coming from tradesmen, merchants, or army people, etc. It doesn't allow for this kind of information to enter the canon. And that's why when it comes in a form of criticism, like Metochitis, it's maybe in an essay rather than in the textbook. So that's one kind of thing I can say to your question about the boundaries, but I take it for, to think even further, because it's one thing what we see in the textbooks, but it will be interesting how that corresponds to, I don't know, to other types of scientific literature or observation that's recorded at the time. And in terms of your first question, actually, if I find it difficult to answer, I'm not sure if I understood it. Because I think that, of course, the idea is there in the sources that they have and they read, so that they're totally familiar with the demand to save the phenomena. But at least in these textbooks, you are not going to see this attempt to do that, because what I've shown to you is also not really about the phenomena. It's kind of an ideological construct that says the world is so. The model of the world is so, and within that model, certain things make sense. And that's spherical geography, geometry. Yeah.
It's the same to criticize as also the idea of this geological.
Yeah. So I wonder, I just don't, I think it will be there. I just don't know the sources in which it appears. So that would be something to find. But I think the conditions for it being there are there. I'm just not familiar where it would be. So if anyone knows, it's good to tell me. Thank you.
I had a similar question about, do we know about more concrete geographies, kind of, okay, this is a very general sort of cosmological division, so to speak, but are there in Byzantine letters descriptions, for instance, of every clime and the cities or peoples inhabiting it? And by the way, okay, I have studied a little the contemporaneous Arabic and Persian literature. So yes, we have this clime theory, perhaps not so much geometrically positioned. I'm not sure about this, but there is also this tradition of cosmological geography citing all the mountains, the lakes, the seas, the peoples, the animals, and the cities according to each. So the usual thing about the cosmology, it starts like this with all these descriptions, and then it goes describing lakes, mountains, seas, and cities alphabetically, but according to each climate. And to this respect, my interest has been drawn lately to the enormous influence of Hellenistic literature, namely of the Alexander's romance in its various versions.
Okay,
so, and how this has indirectly through, for the Arabic case, for the Islamic case, through Syriac translations, how much it has influenced it has shaped the ideas for the faraway lands. So in the Arabic world, for instance, we have these two cities situated in the uttermost east and the uttermost west part, where the sun rises and sets, and where it's, so this is similar. It reminds me of the torrid zone, because these were the parts where the sun sets and rises, so it's very close to the Earth. Of course, it's not a spherical idea of the Earth, but it comes to a tradition, a Quranic tradition, so it had to be accommodated. So the sun was so close that the inhabitants would have to hide into caves during the day. So this, it comes from Pliny the Elder, and then from the Alexander's Romance, from Nearchos perhaps, then to Callisthenes and all this. And then it goes to, it takes, the cities take two names, Jabilis and Jabilka, and so on and so forth. And then from the 16th, 17th century on, they fade away to a mythical dimension. And on the same vein, at least, I mean, both in Oriental and Occidental geographies. So you have this idea of the descriptions of strange people inhabiting, perhaps, I mean, these are the antipodes or the Andom and so on, because there are these people in the Far East or the Far South, which are half men, as the Islamic sources say. And you can see them in Western literature, like in Mandeville's Travels, the cynocephaly, the men with the dog heads, or the half-bodied people, or people with their head on the chest, and so on. I wonder, is there any sign of these traditions or of this kind of descriptions in the Byzantine?
Again, I'll give you half answers based on what I know. So first, the first thing to say is that all the texts I presented to you, they're not geographical texts. So I think that's also one of the points I wanted to make, is that, so these are introductions to astronomy. So they will present these concepts, but then they will explain astronomical phenomena and how things work in the sky. And in fact, there will be this later geographical part that appears, but that's only because it's connected to the astronomical structure. So as I said, in Metochites, you have only 3 chapters in the whole treatise, and in Oikoumenē similarly. So I think that's the first point. It's interesting that in non-geographical literature, through cosmology, the door is opened to the discipline of geography, as it were. Then within this tradition, these strange people cannot be anyone, they cannot be the antipode, because the idea is, in Oikoumenē, for instance, that we cannot cross the ocean and meet the others. And that's why also we don't know the history of them. You have the same idea in Macrobius in Latin. So there is kind of also a frustration, because it's your possibility for communication or discovery of these other people that logically must exist is denied. So that's something that's there. Then in terms of geographical tradition that exists in Byzantium that are scholarly, you have in parallel 2, let's say, main authorities, or two, 3, let's say. So on the one hand, you have a poem by Dionysius Periegetes, which describes the known world. And so this is a poem, it's a didactic poem, and there you have a lot of this, some of this kind of elements. That poem, of course, it's more elementary than Ptolemy's geography. It has different purpose, but they exist in parallel. And in my mind, I like to compare as to have Aratus phenomena as a didactic poem for astral sciences and meteorology, let's say, and to have the Almagest, let's say, to be, again, these 2 traditions. And they live parallelly for different sorts of people and students. But there is also a fundamental distinction between the model of Dionysius Periegetes and Ptolemy, because in the Periegetes, you have the world surrounded by the world ocean. And as I showed you with the map, Ptolemy really radically changes this when he says the Indian Ocean, all this is enclosed by Earth, and then there's this Western Ocean, but there is no Earth Ocean anymore in Ptolemy. And then, of course, there is Strabo as an important authority. So this would be the, let's say, how the erudite sources that there are to learn these subjects. But I don't know what happens in terms of, and in Ptolemy, of course, you have the lists of cities with coordinates, and that would be another way of describing. And you have from this late 13th century onwards, those manuscripts that come with maps, you would have also maps of regions. So you have the two world maps or three, but then you have the regions precisely described with lists of names and also mountains and rivers are included. But there is even non-Ptolemaic tradition like that. So for instance, in some Aristotelian manuscripts of, I think of meteorological again, you have a tradition from the 12th century of a non-circular diagram. It's like an almond shape, and it has the three continents and main rivers, main mountains, because Aristotle also describes, the known world. So there is even that. And as a colleague is doing this research, her name is Chiara D'Agostini, and she's currently researching Byzantine author John Tsetsis, who also in whose manuscripts there are also more geographical, let's say, maps of the Oikoumenē with this kind of features. In terms of the texts that are not those texts I presented to you and are not Ptolemy, Strabo, and Dionysius, I am afraid I haven't read them, so I don't know what to tell you about them. So this is something that maybe others can say. And about the Alexander romance, I think this is a wonderful thing that you are studying this.
Can test your patience by a very short follow-up, just to ask, in this cosmological astronomical works, is there, I mean, I'm again starting from for comparative reasons. Is there any part talking about, the theological point of view? So where is
about which point?
the theological point of view? The theological.
Okay, sorry. Yeah.
So
no,
no,
no, not in this text. They are really clear about where they stand, in terms of disciplinary boundary, let's say. But it's interesting because they come from a different philosophical world. So Cleomedes' treatise is a Stoic cosmology. So for me, the fact that a Stoic cosmology from possibly 2nd century is continuously read, it suggests that you read it in a certain way if you don't anymore endorse that cosmology.
Neither Metochitis nor Pachymeris have anything to say about the position of the universe or
I don't know in general. I mean,
where is heaven and hell and things like that. Paradise. No.
Not as far as I know, but maybe it happens in other texts. No, but I've seen, but they are like not in this text. But for instance, there is well, I don't know if it's well known, but it has been studied. There is a tradition of astrological maps, which is claimed that it comes from, it has a late antique origin, but it appears in medieval manuscripts where you have a map of the world, of the known world, but also the hell is included on this map. So it has a location, it's precisely somewhere in the south, etc. So there is, this would not be the mainstream tradition, but it's also something that is there in terms of maps, for instance.
Okay, well, it's 10 past 10.
Yeah.
So, okay, we can continue since you are staying for a long time, relatively. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
It was exciting. Thank you for coming.
Thank you for coming. Okay, so.